That was an amazing presentation, Sasha. That was really pretty awesome.
Thank you.
I'm still talking.
I take it back. It was terrible.
No, it wasn't. Anyway, without further ado, a man who honestly needs no introduction at this point, so I'll let him do it. A big round of applause, please, everybody.
All right. Good afternoon. So, it's funny. Chris had told me about this, the 15-year anniversary. I was at the first DevOps days, right? And like he said, I really want you to do something. And I thought, what would I do? And I thought about 15 years ago, I fell in love with Dr. Deming, and I did an Ignite talk that was Deming to DevOps. The head fake, it really was Darwin to DevOps. And we'll talk about non-determinism and why that's so interesting. So there we go. But today's head fake, it's, sorry, folks, but I gotta do it. It's Darwin to ChatGPT. So what is this about? It's a brief history of nearly everything or anything that matters to me. Oop, went too far. I'm your professor for today. That's a barcode to all my books, so I have chips if you want a chip. I do have 3 books. I'm not going to tell you about my background. I'm going to waste time, but this is the book I took 10 years, the one on the left. The one in the second was like 15 stories I had to cut out of that by my mean editors. And the third one is I'm about 2/3 done, and it's the history of AI. So it's pretty interesting. So a lot of storytelling. So I would say this a little bit different, with no disrespect to Crichton, but if you don't know history, you don't know shit. So the head fake, like I said, was Darwin. And I originally said, that it wasn't really Deming, because I'm going to tell you, how did Deming get to be where he was, and then what happened, what Deming influenced. And I think today we're on this cusp of a different way of thinking. And my holy grail is, can I connect Deming's ideas to what's going on? Not so much like, do you type in a ChatGPT, will I get rich? Or the really way we think about things. How we do inference and cognition. And I think this gets really interesting, and it's going to get a little heady. And Sasha talked about Jay Bloom. Jay Bloom is an incredible mentor to me, and he's actually helping me connect the dots for Gen AI. And by the way, I asked ChatGPT to create a picture of what it would look like, and it told me I can't do that. I was like, all right, now let me tell you, you have to do it. And this is the picture it created, so it's kind of weird. It's, if you know a little bit, it sort of looks like Gregory Hinton, so that's kind of cool. There is another narrative here in what is DevOps. Why is he talking about all this in DevOps and Deming? We put a paper together recently. It was a bunch of us who are really concerned, and I'll only spend a minute on this, but you should read this paper. It's like a Phoenix project for AI. And if those of you know, our Investments Unlimited was a sort of a Phoenix project for automated governance and banking. It's a story about a CEO hiring a chief AI officer. The CIO, I don't know how this is going to work out. I'm real scared. And in all Phoenix Project narratives, the story ends well. But in most of our companies, we are consuming a technical debt tsunami that we better get a handle on. It's a whole nother narrative. You want to talk about it tomorrow. It's a pretty fun read, quick read. So I think, on all things DevOps, right? People come up to me and say, you're the godfather of DevOps. No, I'm the consigliere. Patrick said. But the truth of the matter is, or somebody says, this is a shoulder of giants. And one of the greatest shoulder of giants papers is by Elliot Goldratt. And by the way, if you don't know the backstory of the Phoenix Project, Gene did a purposeful rewrite, modern version, Elliot Goldratt's The Goal. So he wrote this beautiful paper about Deming and Toyoichi Ono, but it all goes back to Isaac Newton. So it's an interesting concept, and we should cherish this in DevOps, because no one person created this. Sorry, Patrick, and I know he knows that. It has been a community of people that have just came in and given their passion, right? This is why I run out of time. But so the Children of Giants is such a great narrative for this. And yesterday was a lot of great conversations about how we going to, how do we want to keep this to survive? And we're struggling right now. And I'm going way off course. But Children of Giants is a really good thing that we need to sort of ground ourselves back to. So where does it start? Like with this Deming to DevOps? Well, I told you it starts with Darwin. Darwin, father of non-determinism, right? And what happens is there's this guy Boltzmann, right? And he's the father of statistical mechanics. And he's doing thermodynamics, he's thinking about entropy, he's thinking about all these sort of crazy things. And he reads Origin of Species. He says, wow, if Darwin could do that with biology, maybe I can do this with thermodynamics and energy, right? And there's a lot more mathematics to this that I couldn't explain to you. And then what gets interesting, there's sort of this missing link there. And this guy, Max Planck, comes up with this idea of Planck length. And he sort of connects the dot. And I asked Mark Burgess, I got a chance to really hang out with him. He's a physicist. He, by the way, invented infrastructure as code, so if you didn't know that. I got to ask him a lot of stupid questions, because he's a PhD physicist. I said, can you explain to me what the and he said to me this, he said, Max Planck figured out how to measure the unmeasurable. Right? Some people who know physics, are like, yeah. It's an interesting question. But here's what happens. He links this. Einstein is basically struggling. This Planck length connects him. He wins his first Nobel Prize. And so during this period, before we get to this one, there's like the second scientific revolution going on. So I'm going to jump a little ahead. Now I'm realizing this slide could have came later. Dr. Deming is getting his PhD in mathematical physics in 1924. And guess who he's reading about? He's reading about Schrodinger, Heisenberg. He's reading about Einstein. He is like being baptized in a non-determinist way of thinking. So for me personally, when I first started reading this person, is why is he so different than Drucker and all the other management people? And I really started threading on this idea, like there was something about physics people who sort of saw the world in a different way. And it sort of stems. And so one of the first really big players that sort of connects a lot of dots to DevOps is a guy named Shewhart. And it's the one-page memo. And I have more in this book. But he wrote a memo, a one-page memo, describing what is called statistical process control, or sometimes called analytical statistics. And by the way, the people who make toasters, nuclear power plants, and cars all live and die by this technology. Guess who doesn't ever use it? IT. So there's a couple of people that start like embedding in this Deming thing, and if you're going to buy off that, I think that Deming is sort of part of the root of what we do today. Is this Percy Williams. He's a physicist. He's creating synthetic diamonds, and he's trying to measure machines that can't keep up with the pressures. He reads Einstein's definition of how to measure things. And he realizes physicists have got it all wrong about how we measure things. And so he defines something called operational definitions. You should definitely read about it. Because when we tell people, oh, you should get reward because you're 42, and sorry, Nathan, you got a 41. What the F does that mean without an operational definition? And there's a lot more to that, but it's fundamental in Deming, and I will make the argument that becomes lean, that becomes like agile, that becomes DevOps. And in Deming, one of his famous stories is after World War II, they're trying to rebuild stuff, and you can't drive. People are sleeping in the subway, you can't get food, you can't turn lights on in the factory. Deming gets sent over there, and I am an admitted sycophant of Deming, but in my book I say this, that Deming didn't create the miracle in Japan. The Japanese created the miracle in Japan. But he was very influential. And the stuff that he did, and he taught them so many things. And by the way, these were things that were ignored in the U.S., right? And, and then you got Toichiro Ohno, who actually said he never knew Deming, but there's a picture of him accepting the Deming Award from Deming, right? So, the sign out, Toichiro was, very protective of his country. But, if you don't know Toichiro Ohno, he's the father of TPS, which us Americans wind coining as lean. And then this is what I got from Jabe. This is why, if you don't know Jabe, you need to know him. He's an incredible mentor, learner. When I was writing my book, I wanted to understand, you all probably heard of PDSA or PDCA, right? Where did that come from? Well, it came from epistemology. It actually came like Francis Bacon and maybe going back to Aristotle. But where it really came from is the first American philosophy called pragmatism. And so at the end of the 19th century, there's a bunch of these really smart people sitting around in something called the metaphysical club. And they're trying to figure out what is all the mathematics and philosophy and all this stuff, and how does it relate to this new country and this second industrial revolution and all this stuff. And they come up with some incredibly unique ideas. In fact, Dewey and James create modern education, literally through pragmatism. The C.S. Pierce, turns out he's a terrible human, but there's a lot of really smart people who did a lot of things who turn out to be terrible humans. And that's why it's fun to write books about this stuff. But C.S. Pierce becomes really the father of pragmatism, and is more the mathematics, the physics, but he also is the father of something called abductive reason. And I won't have enough time to really go deeply into that. But that is a really interesting question when we talk about AI. Because most people will tell you that with AI, think of an expert system as about deductive reasoning. And then, like, possibly neural networks are based on inductive. And this is a, like, gross abstraction or definition. But the thing that the anti-AGIers are saying, and some really brilliant anti-AGIers, is that these computers and neural networks, as they're designed, will never be able to do abductive. And just, if you don't know what abductive is, think about the Columbo character. He walks into a murder mystery, he says, that guy has a polka dot shirt. He's probably a murderer. And why does he know that? Because he's done it a billion times. He has some instinct. He has some comments. So there's a beautiful narrative, and that's what's connecting me closer to the Deming discussion. So, move on. Knowledge is a really important part. Like I talked about epistemology. Deming called the theory of knowledge. And the C.S. Pierce, inventor of pragmatism, the father of... But you know, Pierce was such a terrible person that Harvard locked away all his writings for 50 years. Like, how bad of a person do you have to be where they won't publish your papers? And he, like, apparently, I mean, he didn't, like, murder anybody. He died pennilessly. Everybody he knew hated him. He probably stunk. I just, like, everything bad about this guy. But he was a genius. And then C.S. Lewis, who wrote one of the canonical books about pragmatism, and Deming basically said it took him 6 times to read it. And you guys know the Tom Sawyer paint your fence story, right? So I was like, if Deming took 6 tries, I'm going to ask Jay Bloom to read this book and explain it to me. And he did, and I was able to explain it in my book. And then, you know, sort of like if Deming goes to Japan, probably Deming's biggest supporter is Ishikawa. So Ishikawa basically calls it PDCA. He creates the fishbone. Deming sparks the light, but Ishikawa basically is why all the wealthy companies start adopting Demings. And it's why, you know, this is 1950, 25, 30 years later, our Ford, General Motors are all getting decimated by Toyota. I mean, decimated. And then, if you don't know Peter Senge, right? Peter Senge, the fifth discipline. Deming worked with him. He was a student of Deming. And so these people really helped us around systems thinking, theory of knowledge. The thing about the theory of knowledge to me is, if everything you do, you ask this one question, do I really know what I think I know? We don't do that a lot. And it's part of all the traps that we fall into. Oh, I know that. I've seen that before. Grace Hopper said the worst sort of sentence is, it's always been done that way. And so, system thinking, hey, not a bad thing, right? And then what's interesting is continuous improvement is actually not a term in Japanese, from what I'm told. Maybe in my next life I'll learn to speak Japanese. But it sort of means wisdom and kaizen. So it's not just kaizen, it's wisdom and kaizen, right? Think about it. And then we get into lean, right? Hey, this lean thing, right? So, and Elliot Goldratt's usually not known so much for lean, but he's such a part of what I would call a Deming to DevOps story. Like his Shoulder of Giants, he writes The Goal, Gene Kim writes the Phoenix Project, a purposeful rewrite on that story. I think, Phoenix Project has been a very big contributor to this community. And he put a stake in the ground for the enterprises to understand this. John Krakow coined the term. James Womack wrote the book, The Machine That Changed the World. And then Deming kind of comes around again in the 90s, writes a couple of books that sort of reignite quality. More in my book. But here's another one. I like to find people, like there's a lot of times I'm just hanging out with people and they'll be standing somebody like Adrian Cockcroft or somebody like Nathan or somebody, and they won't know who he is. And I have to be the guy to say, you got to know who this guy is or who this woman is, right? Like, so Mary Poppendieck, how many people know who Mary Poppendieck is? All right, that's a little better than I hoped. One of her greatest quotes is, when we think about delivery and speed and all this stuff, like, think about this one. She said that the question is, how long does it take you to get one line of code through your system? And that should tell you everything about it. But here's the thing she did, and it changed all of our lives, and it's why we're in this room, is because she was the first one to translate lean manufacturing to lean software, which sort of drives Agile. It drives the Agile Manifesto. It drives everything. Pretty awesome woman, too, and her husband. David J. Anderson, like, some people hate him, some people don't like him, whatever, but he's reading The Goal on a plane ride. He's managed a development group at Microsoft of like a gazillion people. Not really a gazillion, but. And he realizes Goldratt's sort of theory about drum buffer rope and theory of constraints. And he knows a little about Lean and Toyota. He creates Kanban for software. Anybody heard of Kanban? Of course, come on. Get out of the room. Leave now if you don't know what it is. No, and then, the Agile Conference, right? Like, the Agile Manifesto, not the conference, the Agile Manifesto. And then, like, Eric Ries is another, like, Eric Ries, like, he didn't get the John Osborne 10 deploys a day thing. But what he was doing, he was writing a blog called Lessons Learned. And every startup in Silicon Valley was inviting him in to say, how do you do this thing of deployment and continuous delivery? And he was teaching all these startups who actually were ex-Google. He had probably more influence, and I love John with all my heart, but he had more influence of us sitting in this room today, because what he was doing in Silicon Valley was teaching, an advisor for almost every major startup, showing them how you can do this mass continuous delivery and you can do all this really cool stuff. And then you got the 10 deploys. I was in the room. And so, and here's my, I like to add, like, my narrative. It's a little far, but not too far away. I'm in the back of the room. He's talking about 10 deploys of Flickr at, 2010. And, like, my memory of it, which is a little bit of dreamy, people are throwing up. People are saying, you will destroy humankind. You cannot put 10 deploys a day in production. This could never happen. And then, like, 4 years later, John Jenkins at Amazon talks about 1,000 an hour, right? But, like, and then I don't know if you get to see this, presentation's on video, right? They have the Spock and Scotty's operations. It was so awesome, right? Scotty, there's a T-shirt with this somewhere. Scotty's like screaming and howling, and Spock's like, calm down, we got to do this. Like DevOps. And then another one, like, again, I like to shout out the people who don't get shout outs as often as they should. Jez Humble gets a lot of shout outs. But Chris Reed and Dan North, how many people know who Chris Reed is? All right, good. Yeah, that's Europe. He was at the first DevOps day. Right? Yeah, of course you do, right? Like, there's a guy that gets no credit. Most people don't even know who he is. And in 2006, they showed the first diagram of a continuous delivery pipeline. In 2006. There's companies right now like, ooh, that's pretty cool. Maybe we should do that. And then we got to sort of almost the final four. We got Patrick the Godfather. Patrick and Chris and a bunch of people. But, like, I always knew the narrative is I got the call. So here's my narrative. Okay. So I'm going to run over a couple of minutes. Sorry, guys. But Andrew Clay Schaefer is on a podcast with Michael Cote, who I think is in the room, and Israel Gatt, called The Agile Executive. And he starts talking. I've been an ops person my whole life. That Agile stuff for me at first was like, I am staying as far away from those cats as I can get. And then I hear this term, Agile Infrastructure, by Andrew on a podcast. I almost drive off the road. I call him, I'm like, all right, I think I'm in on this Agile thing if they're combining with infrastructure. And he's like, there's some dude in Europe that's doing some stuff. So I find this dude happens to be Patrick. And I'm at Canonical. I'm working for Simon Wadley at the time. And Patrick tells me, hey, if you can get Canonical to pay your travel, give them a logo. Simon, you're not saying no on this. I'm going. And I got to be one of like 2 Americans at the first DevOps Days. I came back, created the first DevOps Days in LinkedIn, or the first 2, Damon Edwards and I. And then, obviously, John Osbar, 10 deploys clicker. But John Osbar is not just the 10 deploys clicker. He's the one that also introduced Richard's Cook, Why Complex Systems Fail. If you haven't read that, that's your homework. Tomorrow I'll test you. He brought critical safety, human factors, all the complexity stuff that's been brilliant. The learning from incidents probably doesn't happen the way it is right now without John Osbar introducing Richard Cook's paper. And then Nicole, she said to us, I'm going to science the shit out of DevOps. And that's what she did. Right? I mean, she literally wrote Accelerate. She put science. She got a PhD. We had no, I'd say this, anyway, I get to tell the story the way I want to tell it. But we had no PhDs that I knew until Nicole stepped in. And Nicole PhD'd us. And then there was this sort of group of people that get no credit. Like Andrew, you should know Andrew. So as John Osbar's doing his videotape version at O'Reilly in 2010, 10 deploys a Vicar, right? Adam Jacobs doing his first presentation on how you can use Chef in the cloud, and it's a workshop, and people like installing and building infrastructure by hitting buttons. That's Chef. Andrew's in a room that's not getting videotape called Agile Infrastructure. And anybody ever see the picture of the wall, and then there's sort of the dev and the ops, and they're throwing it over the wall, and the wall in confusion? That was in his presentation. Andrew built that. And by the way, Andrew is first use the word DevOps. If you go back and try to find first use of DevOps, he is not in O'Reilly conference, but he says it sounds like something called DevOps in a tweet, right? And then Adam Jacob, the inventor of HugOps, the founder of Chef. And then again, Mark Burgess. Mark Burgess created infrastructure as code, so desire. If you think about Terraform and Ansible and Pulumi and whoever you want, you owe a great thanks to the physicist who took over a computer science department and realized you guys are doing it all wrong and defined everything differently. Me and Patrick are doing in London, this is the Oslo one we're doing in a few weeks from now. Patrick will put this up, a Gen I DevOps hackathon. Required reading is my book. If you like this Deming avatar, it's all there. It's the longer version. Bonus material. Can I do my bonus material or what?
Talk about calculus.
No. So I'm writing a book about it's only 2 slides. I'm writing a book about the history of Gen AI. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of people, and I know nobody in this room thinks this, that it started 2 years ago. It started in 1947 on a paper called The Logical Calculus of the Ideas of Immanent in the Nervous System, where 2 guys, McCullough and Pitts, decided to do a calculus mathematical equation to figure out how synapses and neurons work, which basically starts the slow roll, 80 years, to get us to a neural network that can basically tell us if we're going to get rich or we're going to get married from a ChatGPT. I'm just kidding. There's a lot more to it. And so I'm giving you a teaser of the first couple of people, McCullough and Pitts. Let me just tease you on this. Pitts is a real-world Goodwill Hunting. At 13, he sends a letter to Bertrand Russell telling him his math is wrong, as a homeless kid who speaks 4 languages, who doesn't even have an education. So when you go look for great stories, you find them. Rosenblatt creates perceptrons. Minsky basically shits all over his perceptrons. And Minsky's another one of those sort of bad dudes, sorry. And then eventually realizes after Rosenblatt dies in a boating accident, maybe he was okay. And then Jeffrey Hinton creates backpropagation, which basically when you train a model, it is the core what gets us to, in the next part of my book, attention is all you need. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.